This, I think, is one of the more interesting stones out here. Editor, Manistee Gazette, the first paper printed in Manistee. Robert R. Rice. Died February 12, 1868. His parents shipped him his printing press. I think this is the one where the newspaper office started fire and they pulled the press out with a team of horses.
Hi, how are you?
I'm Susan Lund Coyle, and my husband Dwayne started these cemetery walks about 7 or 8 years ago. And due to his love of theater and love of history, we started doing these in the fall because it seemed appropriate to put them around Halloween. For a couple of years, we did one in May around Mother's Day and talked about women who were buried at OakGrove. Since Dwayne passed away, we're back to once a year until I figure out if I could do 2 times a year again, talk about more girls. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be walking for about an hour and 15 minutes unless I get really chatty, and then it might go longer. If at any point during the tour you get tired and you wish to leave, please feel free to do so. You don't have to wave your hand, make an excuse. You can just quietly creep away from the crowd. It's 2 hours.
Debbie was late, I'm sorry. There's for 2 things.
Wasn't that too big?
That was easy.
He was quick. If you feel tired along the way, you are welcome to sit on or lean against the monuments. Children, please do not climb on them. I'll be watching you closer. There are some acorns. OakGrove Cemetery, acorns, yes. There are acorns and twigs on the ground. We also have some monuments that are set low into the ground. Please be careful when you're following me across the grassy areas. Don't catch your foot in something and throw yourself to the ground. Our object today is not to plant any new people, but talk about people who are already planted here. So OakGrove Cemetery began its start in the 1860s. I didn't feel that. In response to a desire to find an organized place to bury people. So here is a clip from the Manistee Gazette from 16 October 1865. Graveyard. Manistee is still without a burial ground, and no one seems to evince any interest on the subject whatever, although we will all need one sooner or later. Everybody seems to think, those that think on the matter at all, that they will find a burial place somewhere and consequently give themselves no uneasiness on that point. But why not a graveyard? So eventually the question was asked, why not a graveyard? And some people got together and decided to develop this property into a graveyard. It was called Lakeview Cemetery for obvious reasons. I guess at one point you could view the lake from somewhere on this property. And burials started happening here, but it wasn't any organized effort. People just came out here and planted their people. But before here, where did they put their dearly departed? if you were fortunate enough to own property, you could plant them. You might have a family cemetery. You'll see family cemeteries as you drive around Michigan. There'll be a field, and in the corner will be a little graveyard. That's a family cemetery. Or you might put your, if you're in the city, you might put your dearly departed in the yard, front yard, backyard. It was very popular for a time, especially after the Civil War, to plant a lilac tree over your dearly departed. Walt Whitman wrote a very famous, very popular poem called Under the Lilacs, commemorating Abraham Lincoln. And so if you have a tremendously huge lilac in your yard and you have an old house, you might want to check that out, okay? You might have something very dear. Manistee Gazette, 23 October 1865. We mentioned in our last issue that Manistee was deficient of a burial ground and suggested that steps be taken for the purpose of securing one. We understand that $440 have been raised by subscription to effect that object since our last issue. They're moving forward. Manistee Times, 16 April 1870. Notice is hereby given that the public will not be permitted to use my grounds as a burying ground for their dead. And those who have friends buried on my land just north of my residence are respectfully requested to make arrangements for the removal of the bodies, and greatly oblige. Well, so people, if they didn't have a yard, and they didn't know what else to do, then they would take them somewhere where they thought it was an abandoned piece of property or an unowned piece of property and plant them. One of the most popular places to put your dearly departed was in a sand dune located about where the armory is now. It was called Creeping Joe. And the only difficulty is that Creeping Joe crept. And as Creeping Joe crept, he left things behind. So it was not unusual to find, I don't know, a coffin, left behind. So at that point, things got really serious. Lakeview Cemetery started getting organized. They couldn't seem to handle it, whoever was trying to do it, and an association was formed to rename this property OakGrove Cemetery. They established rules. They set about recording deaths. They recorded where people were buried. It became a more formal proposition and a more, and because of that, it was a more accessible operation. You didn't have anybody sneaking in here at midnight to plant somebody on the sly. Okay, people were just more aware that this was an important place, a beautiful place. You were not allowed to picnic here, the rules, the association rules. You were not allowed to use this property as a cut through to the lake, especially in your bathing suit. I mean, it was a serious place. So OakGrove Cemetery really got going in the late 1800s. And some names that I will talk about were instrumental in the formation of this property. So I am going to talk about the Fowler Mausoleum, but I'm going to talk about it at the end. And before I forget, like I did yesterday, see the green bag on the ground in front of the van over there? There are Macabre Manistee maps and schedules of events for the next month in the bag. If you remember at the end, please take one, because there are a lot of things happening in the county around Halloween, around fall, that they didn't look quite right. Like maybe they were missing something. And then somebody reported witnessing a city policeman taking money out of a parking meter and pocketing it. So Chief Hebner and the city treasurer set up a sting operation. A sting operation Manistee over parking meters. And they caught somebody. They confiscated the money that he had in his pocket, $4.40. And then the whole thing erupted. There were 11 keys to the parking meters. They could only account for 8 of them. There were about 7 police officers involved in this activity. The whole thing went to court. It was a huge scandal. They hired temporary officers to replace the officers that had been charged. And then the whole thing fizzled out. The officers that were caught were not rehired. Chief Hebner was not involved in any of the criminal activity. You can see he died not too long after that, so I don't know how much of that stress affected his life. But this is Chief Hebner, Roy Hebner, the great parking meter scandal of Manistee. Okay. Come this way. Now, as you look around you, you can see that this is a really beautiful, well-kept facility. I don't know how many of you are cemetery aficionados, but Dwayne and I, wherever we traveled, we always somehow ended up at a cemetery. On our honeymoon, we're at a cemetery. You know, I mean, what can you do? But it wasn't always this way. OakGrove Cemetery Association did a really good job until the men who were in charge of it, they became older and they started dying and people didn't want to take it over. So the county took over the cemetery. And things went from bad to worse. They were not able to handle the upkeep of the property appropriately. In 1965, there was a rash of vandalism in the cemetery and indeed around town, but the cemetery was greatly affected. And many, many monuments were damaged. This, across the street here and across the street up the hill, are the oldest sections in the cemetery, but you would never know it because there are no monuments there. And the reason is those were the ones, because they are closest to the roads, those were the ones who were most severely damaged. In 1971, Ludwig Kiesikowski bought the property from the county for $1. Can you imagine the county's dismay when Ludwig discovered oil on his property? They tried to get it back, but they were not successful, thank heavens, because the Kiesikowskis, Ludwig, his son Jim, Jim's son Eric, they have all been instrumental in maintaining this property beautifully. They did not bother to try and reconstruct monuments. They just cleared away what was damaged and left it to be developed as parkland. There are people buried there. The office knows they've accounted for as many people as they can there and up the hill. So if you come in here and you say, oh my gosh, that's the oldest section of the cemetery, but they got skipped, something happened. There's nobody there. That's why. Okay. Delos W. Filer and Carrie Payne. This was quite a couple. Delos Filer was born in New York at 1843, and he came west to join his father, Delos L. Filer, working the Filer sawmills in Filer City. Golden Filer, E. Golden Filer was another, a brother of Delos W. Delos L, of course, made a tremendous amount of money, and he eventually moved his operation to Ludington, leaving E. Golden Filer in charge of the mill. They also had a salt operation. Delos W. became a part of the firm, but then he had some other avocations. He had some training as he might have called himself a doctor, but he was more of a medicine man. Doctors back then were not trained so much to cure diseases, but to alleviate symptoms. There was not a lot known about how diseases were spread, how they were promulgated, what could stop something from spreading further. So he hung out a shingle for a while until a legitimate doctor, somebody with a certificate, came to town. He married a young school teacher, Carrie Payne. Now it's amazing to me that women school teachers could teach school. They had enough knowledge to teach school until they were married, and then somehow their brain became empty, and they were no longer qualified to teach school. And this happened a lot in that day and age. You could either, girls of a certain social class could either work or they could be married. Nothing in between. Carrie was a firm believer in women's rights, and she kept her maiden name. highly unusual in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She stayed at home. She wasn't employed outside of the home, but she had a good time spending the money that Delos made. He passed away in 1899, and as a widow, she developed a certain reputation in town. She had a beautiful home, beautiful property. Unfortunately, it's no longer there for us to see. But she liked to drive her horses and carriage down the streets of Manistee, and there are newspaper reports of Carrie Filer, because they wouldn't recognize her as Carrie Payne. Carrie Filer driving her horses at breakneck speed on the streets of Manistee. Well, that was probably about 5 miles an hour. Okay, but that was pretty fast for those days. She provided numerous gifts to charity, and this is important because her gifts still go on in this community. She's responsible for the chimes at Guardian Angel Church. Now, she was a Congregationalist. She actually bought the chimes for her own church, the First Congregational Church, but it turned out the tower was not strong enough to bear the weight of the bells. So she gifted them to Guardian Angel. She left her home. She deeded her home to be what we might call today an assisted living center for women of a certain social class, they had to have a certain mental ability. I mean, they couldn't be destitute, they couldn't be mentally ill. But a lot of women were left without resources when their husbands died, and she left her home and endowed it so that for many, many years, her home was available to women who needed a place to live. She also, that endowment, after the home declined and they had to do away with it, that endowment is part of the Manistee Community Foundation now, and it is still providing money for scholarships, for special needs. So Carrie's gift, starting with her husband Delos, has gone on to do good things in the community in which she lived. So the statue at the top, that's not Carrie. That is a symbol of hope. She's got an anchor, and that's how we know that it's hope. So this is Delos W. and Carrie Payne. Any questions so far? Okay.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Their house then is the one up in Filer City, correct?
The Delos L's house. Delos
Okay.
W's dad.
Dad. Okay.
That's his house. Yeah. Okay. Okay, here we go. Something you'll see quite frequently in cemeteries, and it still goes on, but cemeteries will quite often have a family plot, and the family plot will have a large monument, like Jim is leaning on, one that says Barnes, and that just signifies that the Barnes family owns this plot. There is usually not anybody buried underneath that monument. They are buried in smaller plots. They might have a first name. They might just say mother. That's all up to the individuals, the family, how they want to be commemorated. We are going to talk about Susan Barnes, who belongs to this plot. Susan Barnes was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, 1825 to 1889. And Women's Christian Temperance Union was the first mass organization among women devoted to social reform. It's more than prohibition. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was the first organization that provided standardized health and hygiene education from women to women. She wrote a book. It was called Hygiene of the Home. She was the first woman in Michigan to ever publish a book. It's still available as an ebook, a free ebook online. So her gift has been long lasting. Susan and her husband Russell have a stained glass window in the Congregational Church dedicated to their memory. And Mary Hoffrichter, who is my assistant, she's not here today, unfortunately. Susan is her great, I think, 3 greats, grandmother. So I stress once again that if you have family members buried here that have a story, I'm always looking for new dead people to talk about. So if you have a family member here who has a story, come and talk to me afterwards, and we'll explore, and I'll see what information we need to find. So this is Susan M. Barnes.
May I ask a question? Is this the same Barnes family, where the Barnes family home still exists in the neighborhood near Jefferson School?
Yes.
Yes, so that was Mary Kennedy. That
Mary
you said was
Kennedy.
Mary Kennedy.
And-
Mrs.
Great.
Kay Kennedy, her mother was a Barnes.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that's how it
Yeah,
works.
and
Okay.
Dwayne and
Okay.
I bought our home from Mary Hoffrichter and her husband, Dave, and her
Oh, okay.
husband. So we're connected more than just cemetery. 78, went on to become a 20th century grand opera star in Europe. She began her musical career here, graduated from Manistee High School, pursued further musical training in New York, and then went to Europe, where she entered the operatic theater. She furthered her training in Paris. By 1907, she had found her way to Germany and had achieved a wonderful reputation as a mezzo-soprano. Her most famous role was as Mimi in Bohème. But she was greatly admired by the Germans because she could speak German like a German, not like one of those heathens from across the pond. She performed consistently and well until 1914. And what happened in 1914?
War.
War. World War I. Entertainments, the money for entertainments went out the window. Life became difficult almost completely across the board for almost everybody who was living in Europe. And Gail made the only decision she really could make, and that was to come back to the United States. She and an associate opened a school of voice culture and dancing in New York, because whatever was happening over there, over here, people in the United States were still largely trying to pretend like there was not a war going on. So young ladies of a certain social class still had to make their debuts. They had to try and outshine all of the other debutantes and dance better and speak more beautifully. So they got to go to this special school. However, Julia never forgot her roots. She came back to Manistee many times, performing concerts and recitals. She performed at the Ramsdale Theater several times. Her last visit was in 1947. She came back for her 50th high school reunion. She passed away in 1949 in New York State, but she's buried here. And this is not unusual for the times, for family members, married family members, to not be buried together in a cemetery, but to go separately back to their family plot. So Gail is here. Her stage name was Giovanna Gardner. Very classic, very classic. So on her stone it says, to commemorate the life of a great singer whose artistry quickened into living beauty the hearts and lives of all those who were privileged to hear her sing. So she was loved and respected across the board. So this is Gail Gardner. Okay? I'm gonna come this way. This is the resting place of Charles Edward Frazee. He died January 17th, 1888, aged 19 years old. We don't know anything about Charles, but we know a lot about his monument. These are some of the most unique cemetery monuments that you will find. Died in 1888. It looks brand new because it's not made of stone. This is galvanized metal, zinc-coated metal. And because it was able to be made in a factory-style process, salespeople could go out with a book and go into a community and say, what kind of base do you want? What kind of little things do you want on the side? These unscrew. We can put anything you want on the side. Do you want a pedestal? Do you want an urn, or do you want something else on the top? So they could create that monument and ship it to wherever it needed to go, and it could be placed, and it looks just wonderful. It's not affected by time like stone monuments. Stone monuments are terrifically labor intensive to make. They were much more expensive. This was an easy way to have a monument. However, who wants to have their dearly departed buried in the same material, under the same material that a galvanized bucket is made out of? So there was a marketing problem. They had an image problem. They decided to call this white bronze. Sounds much nicer, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. So this monument is by the American White Bronze Company of Chicago, Illinois. You will see these all throughout Michigan. We only have 3 that I have found here. The salesman, I guess, didn't do a really good job here. We have this one. There's a little one here, and there's another little one over on the hill. But the Pentworth Cemetery has about 10. The Traverse City Cemetery has a bunch, and some huge ones. As you're going north on 31 to Traverse City, there are a couple of cemeteries along the right-hand side. If you zoom by there and take a look for this bluish color, once you develop an eye for this, you can see these readily. And there are some up there. My dad and my husband were big Civil War travelers together. They'd take off for a week, 3 weeks, a month, and go visit places where there were Civil War battles. And they always stopped at cemeteries along the way. And at a cemetery in Kentucky or Tennessee, I can't remember, the guide who was giving the talk said, oh yeah, this was one of our most popular monuments through the years, because you see, in Prohibition, they could unscrew this and put the hooch in there. It was a drop-off point for liquor, moonshine or whatever. So you never know what your monument might be used for after you're gone.
Did you look at that one?
I'd be risking my life. So this is Edward Brazee and white bronze monuments. We're going to come up here a little bit. Draped over a bench. It depicts the shoes and the socks set on a chair or a bench. This motif became popular again because of another poem. The poem was titled The Empty Chair. And in the poem, it tells the story of a child who has died and the parents who place that child's shoes and socks on a chair and keep it in the house arranged as a memorial to their departed child. Now, you hear about infant death. Do you suppose that guy went through? How many of us can he plow over?
Quite the ways.
Or maybe he's listening. Who knows? You hear a lot about infant death, and it is a fact of life that a lot of children died. We didn't have safety standards. We didn't have fire codes. We didn't have building codes. We didn't have pregnancy prevention programs. It was not unusual for a family to have 5, 8, 10 children, and out of that have only a quarter of them live to adulthood. It is sometimes thought that then, as a result of that those parents must not have been too emotionally connected with their children, because after all, you lose one and they're little, and then you lose 6 more, how can you really be affected? But that's not true. For the most part, those children were greatly missed. They were mourned over, as you can see by a monument like this. This indicates a great loss to a family. So this is Norma Wyman. The most popular child's ornament was a lamb couchant, a lamb crouched down on its four legs. Unfortunately, children's monuments, lambs in particular, were made of a softer stone, and they did not weather well at all. Many times you'll go to a cemetery and you'll see a little tombstone, and it'll have a little white lump on it, and it was a lamb. It started out as a lamb. Now it's just a little white lump. But that is the case. You'll see some lambs here in this cemetery. So this is Norma Wyman. Okay, this way. As you come to cemeteries, you'll notice that there are a lot of veterans who are from Eastern Army units. Like he came from a New York unit. You'll see that throughout the veterans sections. This is the veterans section of Oak Grove. Although you will see veterans buried throughout the cemetery, we don't have a statue of a Union soldier. We get a gun. This is a Dahlgren gun. It was a siege gun. It would not have been moved away from a fort. Somehow we acquired this gun. But George came to Manistee as part of a resettlement program, if you want to call it that, after the Civil War. The war ended, and a lot of people who had been living in family residences, family homesteads on the East Coast, they had nothing to go back to. Their property was damaged, their families were decimated, they were sick and tired of being in a war on the East Coast. They wanted to go somewhere else, so they came west. And at that point in time, Michigan was the West. And that effort was largely enhanced by Congress passing the Homestead Act. It gave every Union soldier who was honorably discharged from the Army or the Navy, it gave them 5 acres of land. If they could work the land for 5 years, they could keep it. This is a great inducement to get people to move from an overcrowded, unsettled place and get them started somewhere else. Now, you notice I said Union. Union soldiers, Union sailors, not Confederate. So this had some limitations. Michigan sent 90,000 people into the Civil War. 14,000 of them did not come back. Michigan also sent one of the first all-volunteer units to the Civil War. It's apocryphal that Abraham Lincoln said at the beginning of the war, when he was trying to get people to come and fight, it is reported that he said, "Thank God for Michigan," because Michigan was one of the first units that reported. So George Fowler came to Manistee. He opened a bar. He was married, had a couple of girl children, and but he, as I said, he was a reprobate. He was a philanderer. He was a drunkard. In a census, an early 1900s, late 1890s, early 1900s census, his wife's occupation was listed as whore. Well, at some point, his wife said, "That's it, I'm done." And she left him. And George spent the rest of his career in Manistee mostly being locked up for drunkenness. But he did end up here in the veterans section of the cemetery. Now, you'll see that all of these monuments are pretty much alike. They're either standing up or they're flat in the ground, but they have the same basic information. These are Veterans Administration monuments. They are all pretty much the same. The Kiesekowskis will no longer allow the stand-up monuments in the veterans section. They are trying, it's hard. When you have a care for a cemetery and there are so many upright monuments and you have to come and weed whack around all this stuff, you just have to be concerned for that. Another thing that you will see in the veterans section and throughout the cemetery are metal stakes associated with plots. This one right here. This gentleman was a member of the American Legion, so his stakes is American Legion. This might be a service symbol. It might be a club. Somewhere along in here, we do have a veteran from the Cuban War, the Teddy Roosevelt charging up the hill kind of war, and his has that on the stake, so you can see those things as well. So interesting bit of history in a monument that doesn't have much other information on it. Right, so veteran section, Lord Fowler. Okay, now this is a talk by association. This is about a Bauer family plot. This is not the Bauer family plot that of the people of whom I'm speaking, but it's such a good story that we kind of key off of this. Joseph Bauer arrived in Manistee in 1852 at the age of 19. Now, John Canfield, who I did not talk about, whose big family plot is back over there behind chains, you'll find that a lot of people who are buried here of a certain age got their start somewhere in John Canfield's various operations, mostly in wood milling. And that's true of Joseph Bauer. However, he did not stay with John Canfield. In 1865, he set out on his own to become an entrepreneur. He started out as a hotel keeper, and then he built a hardware store, then he built a saloon, and put a grocery store next to it. Now, the building is still with us. It is on 319/321 River Street. So as you're at the head of River Street facing west towards the lake, you come a block in and there's a parking lot across from the Bluefish. All right, on the south side of the street, that corner building, that was the saloon and the associated grocery store. Now, he had lots of kids. He built a big house that we think was located where the Eagles building is now. But not all of his children went on to earn fame, fortune, and a good reputation in the community of Manistee. Two of Joseph's children, Nona and Rose, took up that other profession that was available for women at the time. And in the building that housed the saloon was 2 stories tall, but the room was divided in half, and on the back half of the room was the bar and the storeroom, and above that was an apartment. There was a lighthouse carved into that wall with a window at the top, and it's reported that Nona and Rose looked out that window down at the customers on the saloon floor to scope out their next prospect. Unfortunately, Nona and Rose both died very young, in their early 20s, of illness. The owners who eventually purchased the building discovered that Nona and Rose liked it so much there that they never left. And they know that Nona and Rose are there because Nona and Rose have a fancy for chocolate chip cookies. So they bake them. And the aroma of chocolate chip cookies comes out of nowhere in the building. The owners found out who Nona and Rose were. They appear as ladies in white. They went to the Historical Museum looking for photographs associated with their building, and lo and behold, there was a photograph that had Nona and Rose in it, and they were able to identify them. They're not the only children left there. There's a brother, Billy, who also died very young of an illness. Billy likes to make himself known by unscrewing basement light bulbs and letting them fall to the floor. He has also been seen as an orb in the building. I think that's Billy. Now, Joseph, as I said, he was pretty successful, and until something happened in October of 1871. What was it? Fire. We're coming up on an anniversary, October 7th, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire. Well, it was more than the Great Chicago fire. Chicago certainly suffered greatly, about 250, 300 people killed. Manistee had a lot of property destroyed. Most of River Street was destroyed. All the buildings, of course, were made of wood. But the real disaster was Peshtigo, Wisconsin, where 1,500 people lost their lives. The fire came so fast and in such a wind that they had no avenue of escape. But now back to Mr. Bauer. His building was destroyed by the fire, but he was a smart old German. Everybody else had their insurance companies, their insurance held by companies in Chicago. So what happened to all those records? Poof. Joseph's insurance company was in Grand Rapids. So he was able to get $15,000 from his policy and rebuild. So that's why we still have the building there. So that's the Bauer family. We're going to go over to... Now, I'll just point out that the rectangular box that's set in that triangle, that's E. Goldenfiler, G. Los W. Filer's brother. He's buried there. This Barnes monument is another Hofrichter, Mary Kennedy Hofrichter Barnes. She has a lot of family buried here. That's another one. Every time she comes on the tour, she tells me about somebody else. So this is the Buckley Mausoleum. I'm almost obliged to talk about the mausoleums because they're big and they're evident and they're each unique from the other. They are 3 individual mausoleums. So this is the Buckley Mausoleum. Edward Buckley was a Brit. He was born in England in 1842. He came to the United States through Canada and eventually settled at the age of 14 in Milwaukee, where he took up the trade as a tinsmith. Tinsmiths made kitchen tools. They didn't make farm implements. They made pitchers, cups, plates, but one of the most important things they made was metal ceilings. You have an old house today and you look at your metal ceiling and think, wow, isn't that pretty? What a decoration. It was actually a fire barrier between floors. It could restrict the flow of a fire. So tinsmiths had a very important place in a community. But he didn't stick with tinsmithing. He was a self-aggrandizer. He liked to talk himself up big. He did serve in the Civil War, and according to him, he served in 11 battles, including Missionary Ridge and the Siege of Atlanta. Big stuff. He did really well, formed his own hardware firm when he came back in 1868, until the Panic of 1873. Now, a panic in 1873 was the same as a depression in 1939, is the same as an economic downturn in the 1980s or whatever it is we're going through. It is a time of great economic stress. And he lost everything. But in a sense, he didn't lose everything because along the way, he married Mary Ruggles. And through her, he met his brother-in-law, Charles. Now, Ed was a big talker. Charles had money. So they got together and formed a partnership, and things went along really well for a time. They had their own goods railroad. They were responsible for a lot of activity, a lot of economic activity in Manistee. Until one day, a sheriff went to their office and informed Charles that a morals charge was being brought against him. Now, this is like a sexual offender thing. This is serious. Charles is a man of business. He cannot afford to have a negative reputation, any kind of gossip. He can't have that swirling around him. So he gets on the train to go talk it over with his lawyer in Grand Rapids. And who's on the train? Oh, surprise! Well, Ed, I didn't know you were going to Grand Rapids too. Well, what are you doing on the train, Charlie? Well, I got to talk to the lawyer because you see, I got this thing going on. Ed says, I have the perfect solution. I will buy all of your Manistee assets for $1 million. I will pay you $100,000 a year for 10 years. You run away. You leave the country. We'll go to the lawyer. We'll have it all drawn up in a contract. We'll have it all recorded at a courthouse, and bye-bye. So that's what they did. Nothing had ever been proved against Charles. Okay. We suspect that there may have been some Ed nefariousness going on here. Charles left. For 10 years, he traveled through Europe. He still had money. He bought a yacht. He sailed the Great Lakes. He settled in Chicago. Ed came back and just was Ed. In all of those 10 years, he never paid Charlie a single penny. And Charles finally had it up to here, came back to Manistee, and filed a suit against Ed. It took 5 years to settle it. In the end, Charles won. But in that 5 years, Charles bought a home in Manistee, not too far away from where Ed was living. So they got to see each other on a fairly regular basis. Now, Ed also was a womanizer. He married after Mary died. He married Joni Sloan from Thomasville, Georgia. He had a daughter, Virginia, but Joni had it with his whatever he was doing, and she divorced him. Now, this was in the early 1900s, so for a woman to divorce a man in the early 1900s was huge. It was a huge thing, very brave of her to do that. And then Buckley, at the age of 69, married the 29-year-old Dorothy Pelham from New York. And while they were living here in Manistee, at some point Ed decided that Dorothy she wasn't all there in the upper story. She was a little mental. So he had her incarcerated at Eastern State for 50 years. She was there. He died, of course, before she did. Now, this mausoleum has Ed, and it has Virginia, and there might be one or two other people buried here, but this is his. It's pretty impressive. Like I said, he could talk big and put a good face on it. The eagles are a Masonic emblem, not a family crest. Okay, so this is Ed Buckley. Okay, Jane Canoose was like many women of the era in which she lived. She was born in 1876. Women were not supposed to be anything except a reflection of their husband or their father. So their names were only supposed to appear in the newspaper 3 times: when they were born, when they got married, and when they died. And they were never known by their own name in the newspaper. Again, I'm talking about women of a certain social strata. They were always Mrs. Canoose, or the daughter of. They never had their own name. So she followed this same kind of path. She was well loved in the community. She was a kind-hearted woman who had care and concern for the people around her, and demonstrated that care and concern through actual acts of charity. She was a school teacher until she married, because then she couldn't teach school anymore. She had one of the biggest weddings the community had ever seen. A huge wedding. She married Harry Canoose, a purchasing agent for the Goodrich Transportation Company, and she set forth with him as he was transferred to various offices throughout the Midwest. They had a daughter. They were doing fairly well until, horror of horrors, they heard in Manistee that Jane had died in Detroit at the age of 36 after complications through surgery. Harry brought her home, and he buried her at OakGrove Cemetery. Somewhere over there. Plain grave. Little monument over there. 8 months later, Harry decided that Jane needed to have more. She needed to have something a little more special. So, I guess 14 months after. So he spent $8,000 to build this wonderful mausoleum for Jane. And Jane is the only person in there. Harry's not there. And I have a story about that a little later. Harry is poor Harry in this case. If you come here on a day when the sun is setting in the west, you can see there's a beautiful stained glass window of the sun setting in the west. Again, going back to the vandalism of the cemetery, that window got broken. And maybe 7 or 8 years ago, Mark Fetter, who is with the Manistee County Museum, and if you don't know what a treasure you have in him, you haven't been to the museum or talked to him lately. He was out here wandering around as he does, and he noticed the broken window. He took it upon himself to track down the surviving granddaughter in California, sent her pictures and described the damage. She sent him the money, and he took it under his responsibility to have the window replaced. So this is living history. This is living history. So this is the Canoes Mausoleum with a wonderful, just a wonderful window. Okay. Any questions so far?
What year?
She died in,
Or what year was this built?
well, she passed away in 1910, so it would have been 1911.
Okay.
Ish. Okay. So, Jane Canoes. Okay. Now we're going for board only. He didn't get a wage. He worked in order to have a roof over his head and food to eat. And it was really hard work. You go out in the woods in the winter and chop wood because you don't have leaves on the trees to get in the way of falling timber or to make it more difficult for you to haul fallen logs out of the woods. Lumberjacks worked through the daylight hours, dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. On the 7th day, they had to take care of things like their tools or catch up on their drinking or whatever. They slept in wooden dormitories. They ate food that was abundant but monotonous. Pork and beans, heavy on the beans. Cornbread, molasses cake, coffee or tea. Can you imagine 7 days a week having that? I just sometimes wonder what the gas level was like in there. Sands continued as a lawyer for several years until he had saved enough money to set up his own logging operations under contract again with John Canfield. His businesses grew. He established more and more sawmills. At one point in time, there were about 25 sawmills around Manistee Lake. Louis Sands had several of them. He also had 2 schooners that he used to ship his sawnwood down to Chicago. He established logging operations in Canada. He was a pretty big gun in the lumbering world. He died in 1905. He always prided himself on treating his employees generously, although his employees had a little bit of a different opinion. I don't know if any of you know the state song, My Michigan. It's set to My Michigan, My Michigan. I don't know all the words to that, but I have the words to this little company song that some people, some men, wrote while they were working for Louis Sands and Sands' associate at the time, Jim McGee. Who feeds us beans until we're blue? Louis Sands and Jim McGee. Who thinks that nothing else will do? Louis Sands and Jim McGee. Who feeds us beans 3 times a day and gives us very little pay? Who feeds us beans again, I say? Louis Sands and Jim McGee. So they had their own little protest going on. So here, this is Louis Sands. Okay, coming this way. being the theater person that I am here in town, I can never possibly go by the Ramsdell Monument without saying a few words. I have to be careful not to give you the whole theater tour while I'm standing in front of a tombstone. But Thomas Jefferson Ramsdell was trained as a lawyer and was actually recommended to come to Manistee by his boss at the time, who was a state Supreme Justice. He was essentially headhunted to come to Manistee. This was in 1863, 1860. It took him 7 days to get here in a sleigh. There were no roads. There was really no communication that was instant and immediate, new communication. But in Manistee, there were no lawyers. If you wanted to have a contract written, you had to go to Grand Rapids. If you wanted to have a document legalized, you had to go to Grand Rapids. So this was an important function to fill in this growing community of Manistee. During the time that he was here, he also turned into a great community activist. He was one of the leading lights in the OakGrove Cemetery Association. He was elected to the State House of Representatives. He served as county treasurer. He was a member of the school board for 18 years. He formed a corporation which built the first bridge across the Manistee River, where the Maple Street Bridge is now. Before that, it had been a ferry service. But he was a smart businessman, and it was a toll bridge. So formed the bridge. And of course, it was destroyed in the fire, along with a lot of things. He opened the first hardware store in Manistee, helped establish the first newspaper, founded the first national bank, and established the Manistee Waterworks. He was very busy, very busy. He took the time to get married and have a slew of kids. One of them was Frederick Ramsdell, who was an artist, kind of unusual for the time, and he is responsible for the fine decorative artwork inside the Ramsdell Theater. Because, I mean, if you got a kid and he's an artist, a little nepotism, eh? Okay, we're going to hire the kid, right? Okay. And his TJ's youngest daughter, Ruth Ramsdell, never really went to school. As I said, she was the youngest child, and TJ had pretty much retired from all of his activities in Manistee, and TJ and his wife were traveling, and Ruth traveled with them. So she was never lettered or diplomaed. She didn't really have any kind of training to do a job. She met and married a Grand Opera star in Europe who turned out to be a bad businessman. This all happened after TJ had passed away. TJ died in 1917, by the way, and the theater went dark for a long time because of the war. So we're fortunate to have it today. But Ruth was left a widow with a child, and she had to make a career for herself. And she did several careers. She was pretty gutsy. Not the career that women are not supposed to talk about, but she went on to form some legitimate work propositions for herself. She was a children's author. She wrote 14 books. The museum, I think, has 2. But there's a problem when you're writing a book. You write and you write and you write and you write, but you're not earning money. And then you send the book to the publisher. You might get a little advance, but maybe you don't. And then you wait until the book is published to start bringing royalties in, and maybe you start writing another book, and you write, so it's not steady income. So then she went on the family, I don't know what you want to call it. It was a road show. She was a demonstrator cook. So the show would come into town. It would set up at the Armory. She was kind of like the Julia Childs on the road. She would prepare recipes. She would sell the pots and pans that she used. She would sell the cookbooks that she used. She would demonstrate the cooking, So that's great, but she's on the road. And she has a child. So she finally settled into the career that was going to be good for her for about 25 years. she became a Dear Abby columnist. She dispensed advice to newspapers from Atlanta to finally settling into a newspaper in Kentucky. But she was a very acerbic advice columnist. She didn't sugarcoat anything. One letter came to her, and the complaint was, "My son is threatening to leave home unless I buy him a car." And she wrote back, "Help him pack." So this is another case where she died away from Manistee and was brought back to Manistee to be buried in the family plot. So Ruth is right behind here, a flat stone right here. Her married name was Campbell. So these are some of the Ramsdells. Okay. He had a Navy, and it was very active, but he enlisted in the Navy. He was assigned to the USS Signal, which was a tin-clad paddle wheel boat. Tin-clad, not a lot of protection, but I guess it made the men who served on her feel like it was something. May 4th, 1864, the Signal set off with a troop transport, the USS Warner, downriver on the Red River campaign. Now, the object of this campaign was to sail the Red River to Texas and block the Confederates' cotton trade, to cut that link so that the Confederates could not sell cotton in order to get money to use for their side of the war effort. It was an ill-concealed secret, and the Confederates mounted a terrific ambush on the Red River. They had brought in siege cannons. They had 600 dismounted cavalry all on the bluffs alongside the river down here. They opened fire, and it was low water. The ships both went aground, and they were all trapped. John was able to slip the anchor of the Signal, which means he just released the anchor so that the boat could float free. It still had no steerage, but it was able to slide into a position to provide some cover for the Warner, for the troop ship. He was nominated, he was injured severely. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor by the only surviving naval officer, the ship's physician. He was awarded the medal. Now, the Medal of Honor during the Civil War was the only medal that could be awarded for anything. You could get awarded the Medal of Honor for significant bravery in a time of action, as John Highland was awarded, or you could get a Medal of Honor as a bribe for re-enlisting for 6 months. So it was not an across-the-board good thing. There were rules about how it should be awarded. They were largely ignored in that time of strife. In about